Thanks to the authors and the discussant of this paper, we have to move quite quickly to the second paper, which is a related, very closely related, as a matter of fact, paper. It's a paper on regional convergence, presented by Giovanni Iuzzolino from Banca d'Italia, Guido Pellegrini from Università di Roma La Sapienza, and Gianfranco Viesti from the University of Bari. Who is actually presenting? Key presenter? Okay, Gianfranco Viesti will present.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Chairman. Good afternoon to everybody. I am Gianfranco Viesti. I'm here with Guido Pellegrini and Giovanni Iuzzolino. We are presenting this paper dealing with convergence among Italian regions in the 150 years. The aim of the paper is to tell a story about the convergence of per capita income among the regions, but especially identifying the turning points of this story, the periods in which the direction of the process changes. And we try to assess the role of the components of income per capita, that is the component of income, productivity and employment, as well as economic structure, and the component of population, that is its fertility, birth rate, death rate, and migration. We try to assess the changes in human indicators, and especially we try to sketch a possible role for national policies, both of general policies and of regional development policy in this process of convergence. Our main results are as follow. This very large income gap is a relatively recent phenomenon that is dating after the First World War. Its determinants have changed substantially in different periods, that is, the determinants of the calculated gap in income per capita are different in different periods. There was, as we all know, a period of convergence that was limited to a couple of decades after World War II, but they were very special decades in which the growth of the entire Italian economy was the strongest ever, and the policies have always played an important role in this history. We use a lot of new data that are available in the last few years. One of the suppliers of the data is Professor Malanima with this well-known paper of 2007, who is here discussing, but as well as Professor Fenoltea wrote a lot of very nice paper, even for this project of Banca d'Italy. Professor Vecchi wrote this very interesting book. So we were able to use a lot of data. Using these data, we used both series, both Malanima and Vecchi series. I have no time here for distinguish as well, but the basic story, I don't know if Professor Malanima agrees, is basically the same. So 5 periods. First 20 years, small disparities, both north, south, and west, east, with weak divergence. Then, up to the First World War, industrialization in the northwest. So divergence between the northwest on the one side and the rest of the country on the other side. Then we have the period between the two wars, a little bit before the First World War, a little bit after the Second World War. That is the period of the real divergence. That's the divergence between the North and the South. So this creates this huge divide. Then we have the 20 years of strong convergence. And then we have the last 40 years in which the Northeast and the Center perform much better. So they reach the levels of the Northwest, while the disparities between all the Central Northern region and the Southern regions remains basically unchanged. This is the story in the 5 periods. The green line is Northwest vis-à-vis the other regions. The red line is the Center North vis-à-vis the South, while the blue line is the old east-west disparities. They completely disappear after the 1970s. They were not so small at the beginning. In the first 20 years, this is a well-known story, all regions were based on agriculture. There were disparities, west-east disparities, probably linked to the role of ancient capitals of the states that were there before unification, as well as some limited north-south difference, as the historians know. Professor Federico New estimates on agriculture has revised this story, but we basically say that the difference were small. Some southern regions were performing very well in agriculture, exporting agriculture, but in the same time there were differences in the so-called preconditions for industry, very different conditions for industrialization. This is a table. We choose some data. I will show in particular the literacy rate that was completely different in the country. It has been completely different in the country up to the 1960s and 1970s. This also shows crimes per capita, showing that in the South the crime rate was higher. Railways per capita as well as roads per capita were completely different. And now we have this data on water. Water means transportation. Water means energy. These are new tables that Giovanni Iuzzolino designed for this paper. On the left, your left side, you have literacy rate by comprensori. Again, you see this story of the Northwest being at a much higher level than the rest of the country with this kind of north-south gradient. On the right side, you have, on the contrary, this work made of comprensori, always on comprensori, trying to sketch the presence of specialized industrial districts. The basic information is that the South was not so bad. There were some presence of manufacturing industry in 1871. They were still there until the end of the century. The industry in the South doesn't seem to disappear after unification at all. Then we have, of course, a lot of historians. Professor Zamagni, who is here, wrote this story of the takeoff of the Northwest. We think that is a normal story. Regional disparities appear. This is the first turning point. Why? You can read a book on the Italian economic history much better than our paper. All the things are already there. Industrial growth is concentrated in a triangle because of geography, because of education, because of transportation, because of energy, all working in the same direction. Regional disparities are explained by industrialization and unexplained, of course, by productivity. Demography doesn't matter so much because all the demographic trends in the region are quite similar. Emigration starts in the northeast, so favoring income per capita in the northeast. Only in the first decade before the World War I, there is a stronger emigration, that is emigration abroad, of course, from the south. But demographic data are definitely very weaker than productive data in explaining income per capita difference. But this was not a totally natural story. We try to say something about the role of policies. Public policies were limited. There were large defense expenditure. Professor Basevi first was saying something about war and being defense, of course, in the northwest and the northeast, because the borders were there, the military forces were there. Terni was built somewhere because of military. And so military is important. Educational expenditures are not so large. The responsibilities are given to municipalities until 1910-11. So the effort in closing the literacy gap is not at all strong. The only large policy is the railway policy. Railways are developed a lot in the south, but some historians, in particular Professor Fenaltea, warns us against the risk of interpreting the railways as a great way of integrating national market. Nitti was saying the same things in that period. Trade policy and industrial policy, of course, help industrial development. They are quite natural as well, because all the European countries in that period were relatively protectionist, because we had to build our national industry, so regardless of its location. So, but in the same time, the trade tariff reduced the specialized agriculture exports of the South that were especially they were going to France by sea. So when we saw this morning that the main market became Germany, but unfortunately we have not the sea between the Mezzogiorno and Germany. You have to make a tour of Europe. So it's not exactly the same thing as sending a ship to Marseille. But Questione Meridionale emerges in the policy debate, and when Prime Minister Zanardelli goes to Basilicata, and the whole country wants to do something for the development of the South, for industrialization of the South. So the new laws, Bagnoli is born, Ente Volturno is made there, because the whole Italy, not only Nitti, but all the other Italian leaders want to make something to make also the South participating in industrialization. So we have a thesis and hypothesis that this is a missing turning point. There were some forces for convergence, maybe. People from South were migrating, regional policy had been designed, but the war came in and everything was changed. The boom, here we have some slide regarding 1911, 1951. We have to say that we had much more problems in this period because the sources and the books and the articles on this period are much fewer than the following and the first period. So we have very tentative lines on this, but the data tell us that this is the key period for divergence. So why? We try to tell some stories. The stories are about the booming, the industrial booming in the Northwest because of the war. Professor Zamani's book have a list of all the plants that worked for the war divided by industry. So they were there, not because they were against the South, but they were already there. Several firms were rescued by banks, and then IRI, and then autarkic policy, and then the growth of domestic demand. Industry remains in the Northwest, but there is a first movement toward the Northeast. Probably Professor Caselli's comment was very interesting from this point, because the growing demand in the north, in Veneto and Emilia, say, moved a little bit east toward the center of industry, moved out of Milan, Turin, and Genoa, maybe. In any case, the regional development policies for the Mezzogiorno are completely abandoned. Some policies are made in favor of Northeast and Center. This is the period of Marghera, of Ferrara, of Bolzano. Minister Volpi says that we have no regional problems in Italy, so we can go on building Marghera. The South remains agricultural, no export possibility, decreasing agricultural productivity. No migration. A lot of pro-fertility policies, so natural increase much faster in the south. The north is modernizing. People live in the cities, so the number of children per family goes down in the north while it remains stable in the countryside of the south. First welfare starts, but it's linked to employment. Modernization of railways is completely in the center north, except for the Rome-Naples railway, if I remember well. Hospitals are still privately financed, so in the book of Vecchi we have the story of Molinette, of Niguarda growing in the north, while the hospital beds per capita in the south were 5 to 4 times less than the rest of the country. So this is the period of divergence. The divide is huge. What we show here with the red lines is the speed of divergence if it goes down, or of convergence if it goes up. What we want to show here is that the red lines are larger as far as you go towards 1951. There was divergence before the First World War, but the speed of divergence increases after the after what? Here we say 1911. Probably it's 1925, 1926. In any case, there is a missing turning point. Here you have this calculation. In the blue line is GDP per capita. It is very similar to other graphs you already saw. The red line is population of the south as percent of the population of the center north. So you see some movements. It goes down after 1900. This means more immigration from the south. This goes up after 1921. This means higher fertility in the south, but the movement of the red line are smaller than the movement of the green line. That is production of the south in percent of the production of the center north. So we are back to, we arrived in 1951. 1951 is no, let me add something about the post-World War II, because it was the fascist period, but the same trends still are in the second half of the 40s. As Pasquale Saraceno said in a very famous interview on Reconstruction, the effort of Reconstruction was completely based in rebuilding the industry of the North. Again, it was a reasonable national policy, but again, a policy favored a strong divergence. Regional migration in Italy remained forbidden until the late 50s. So we had illegal southern immigrants working in Milan in the late 40s. 5 minuti ancora, no? 1951 was a key year because the distance was huge, so the south was very poor. All the people were blocked in the countryside, low productivity agriculture, two Italies. The Questione Meridionale emergence and Intervento Straordinario. Then we have the second turning point, that is 1951. Per capita income in the south grows very fast, and this happens when the per capita income in the center north grows fastest ever. Convergence is again explained mainly by industrialization, by productivity, and productivity is due to industrialization. That, as you know, I go a little bit faster both because I have only 5 minutes and because this part of the story is very well known. State-owned investment and private north and western firms investment in the south. 2/3 of the convergence explained by productivity, 1/3 of the convergence explained by emigration from the south to the north. An interesting point is that now we have the national market. This means that the industry of the south works to complete the national supply, and that demand in the south works as a demand for the national industry. But this means that northern firms arrived probably for the first time selling their product in the south, and this means that a large part of the handicraft that still existed in the south disappear in this period. So you have this period in the south in which large firms grow and small firms decline. This is a key difference vis-à-vis the center northeast. You have again the same graph. Now please look at the 51-71, the green line going up, that is production in the south as a larger share of national production. The red line going down, that is emigration from the south to the north. So the blue line goes sharply up, that is catching up in per capita income. Rate of accumulation was very strong in the south in this period, double than in the central north in seven years. The population story, I already said something. Natural growth in the south is still higher, but people are free to move, so people go to the north, and this is a double count in our convergence story, because in the same time population decreases in the south and increases in the north. This helps, again, the industrial boom. The national market of labor becomes more integrated, and this helps Italy, helps overall development. And for the first time, public policies favor convergence. They are not policies for the South. They are national health policy, national education policy, a little bit of national welfare policy. They go to all regions, but they go in per capita terms for the first time, and this helps convergence. So there is a strong improvement in the human development indicators. After 1 century, elementary school enrollment becomes similar all over the country. So this is human development in the Mezzogiorno. Then we have the last minutes with the last part of the story, the end of the miracle, the end of the convergence, the last turning point. Why? We think that this period still needs more research. Many possible factors, but it's not clear, at least to us, which are the most important factors. Of course, we have this story. Most of us know very well this story. Changes in the international scenario hit much more the Mezzogiorno because of the size composition, the sectoral composition of its industry, because of its inward orientation, because industry in the south was born to serve the national processes, downstream processes. So the steel of Taranto was for car production in Turin. A great push of small and medium enterprises that are export-oriented, but we have much fewer small firms in the south. The rate of export over GDP increases all over the country, but in Campania it starts at 4%, in Veneto it starts at 15%, so the impact of the conquest of international markets by Made in Italy is much smaller in the south than in the northeast. Northwest is hit, Liguria goes down, Piedmont as well, and so we have the total convergence of the third Italy vis-à-vis the first Italy, and the second Italy, this is the south, remaining back. Overall Italian rate of growth declines, investments are devoted to restructure, much more than to enlarge production, they decline. Labor demand in the north slows down, so inducing lower migration, but natural population increase continues to be higher in the south. Productivity differential remains unchanged or increase a little bit, but labor cost differential are closed very rapidly after Autunno Caldo, after 1968. So unit labor costs in the south are worse and worse in the period. There is industrial growth in the south, but the total size of the exporting sector of in southern economy remains small. And so labor demand is too small, and the Questione Meridionale changes from a question of poverty to a question of unemployment. This graph is about the lack of competitiveness, price-cost competitiveness of southern industry, and this is about unemployment in the south, we all know. And then the last 2 minutes for the last 3 slides. What more? Policies. Policies are important. Regional policies lose momentum. They become technically weaker and more related to political needs. Intervento straordinario dies. Several years with no policy at all. Then nuova Ciampis, nuova programmazione, but with very small results. Current public expenditure increase all over the country, but its quality, as the Bank of Italy has reported in its research of last year, is much poorer in the south than in the rest of the country. Public infrastructure in the south are much less than in the rest of the country. So the quality of public services remain poor in the south. Organized crime increasing in several southern regions. So the regional differential in conditions for competitive firms remains very large. And nowadays, last 20 years, very limited rates of growth. Internal migration start again. A crisis of public expenditure in the south. Delocation of part of the industry that first was in the south towards new countries. So this period of stable, large disparities. Conclusions. Our conclusions are, the first is about turning points. A lot of people think that the Questione Meridionale has always been there, is always similar, and this morning Marcello De Cecco was reporting about the problems of Hannibal with the underdevelopment of Calabria. We say that we have a very interesting story, very different pattern, east-west and north-south, and the key period is the fascist period, and the First and the Second World War. Of course, the southern question has very long duration, but productivity, sectoral composition of the economy, fertility, migration play very different roles in explaining the dynamics of per capita income. So our suggestion is don't look so much into the Middle Ages, look much more at the interwar era and the fascist era. And the last slide is about policies. We think that policies matter for this story. Not because they were pro-North or anti-South, but because they were important. Convergence with respect to social variables were clearly influenced, but what the new Italian state was able to do in the 19th century, what was done in the fascist era. Vecchi's book reports of this increasing divergence of personal income that is a part of the story that probably has to do with this in the interwar period, and then the 60s and the 70s with education, health, infrastructure. The birth of the fascist regime probably created very negative conditions for the South, and again, post-World War II, the first period, very favorable, and the policies after the 1970s less favorable. National policies today still seem to us very important in explaining the divide, because the provision of public services and the still lagging locational factors for competitive firms, in our opinion, still remain the main factor explaining this gap in the ability of producing, of the production per capita, and especially in the demand for labor. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much. Okay.
Well, the paper presented by Gianfranco Viesti and Iuzzolino and Pellegrini is a general reconstruction of a long period of Italian history, and with a specific focus on the economic policy and the importance of the economic policy on the North-South disparity in the long run. I agree on the main lines of this reconstruction. I think that they are right in their periodization. And then I will comment some marginal elements of their reconstruction. And I will comment on the basis of this graph. I present here some revised data by myself and by Vittorio Daniele on per capita GDP in the Italian regions in a long period from the last decade of the 19th century until nowadays. And we see on the vertical lines an index of inequality, and we can use other indexes, but more or less the results are the same in this case. And we see also the vertical lines, the periodization proposed by the previous paper. And I only made a small change in the first part, and instead of presenting two periods, I present only a period, since we have no data on GDP until the last decade of the 19th century. For the rest, we see on the horizontal line the per capita GDP in euro and in logs. And we have in front of us a general overview of the North-South disparity in Italy, and I think that the paper presented by Viesti more or less agree in its periodization and the importance of changes taking place in the regional diversities in Italy. I would say, first of all, this graph doesn't start with the unification of Italy, but start only at the end of the 19th century. We know that at that time, in the first half century after the unification, we know that some differences between North and South already existed, and probably they existed already at unification. So we know that some social indicators attest the difference between North and the South. We know that railways, rivers represented an advantage, a potential advantage for the northern part of Italy. And in particular, we can stressed in the paper just now presented, that the literacy rate was different in the north and the south. This was the main difference between these two parts of the country, much more important than the difference in life expectancy or mortality rate. In those cases, only a few points of difference. In this case, by contrast, the difference was relatively heavy. So I think that the authors of this paper could agree on this quotation of what has been written by Vera Zamagni, commenting a paper by Emanuele Felici a couple of years ago. That is, in the pre-industrial era, we cannot expect much difference in per capita GNP among agrarian areas. It is therefore of the utmost importance to review other indicators that can explain why an area showing an income per capita similar to another area is capable at some point of taking off with an industrial spark, while the other remains stagnant. Indeed, similar levels of GNP can be the result of different economic and social mechanisms at work. I think this is a summary of my opinion on this first phase. In this first phase, there are some potential advantages for the North. North is part of the continent of Europe. By contrast, south of the Apennines, there is a Mediterranean world with different characteristics. So I think that what has been told in the previous paper on the geographic advantages is important especially in the first phase of modern growth in Italy. I think that in this first part of, in this first period, it is important also to stress the data concerning agriculture, and they lack it all in this paper. And I think that data worked out in these last years by Giovanni Federico per region are important because we find at the end of the 19th century, that is when data on GDP are available, we see that there is some advantage in industry in the north, there is some advantage in services as well, but in agriculture, probably because the population density was lower in the south, and the difference was remarkable. This is probably because just of the importance of agriculture in this calculation, there is some modest advantage, but at the end of the 19th century, the difference between North and South in terms of per capita GDP is between 5 and 10%. So I think there were potential advantages. I see that in the case of industry, there is an elaboration there are some series, some data in the appendix 2 of the paper, and in this data, the authors try to show that in industry as well, there was an advantage in some northern region in 1871. In 1871, the basis is our data from censuses. We must, in a sense, modify a little this data, because if we take this data literally, in 1871, the main the labor force was mainly employed in industry in the south more than in the north. Here, I followed the example by Verrazamagni, and I downsized the importance of the labor force in the secondary sector, because in 1871 the main industrial regions were Calabria and Sicily. If we follow the data from the second Italian census. Well, coming back to this graph, we see that in the second period there is a remarkable growth of inequality, of disparity between South and the North. We see that in terms of per capita GDP there was an increase, but relatively modest, but the disparity increased considerably. we see that the index of inequality reached a top before the Second World War and immediately after the Second World War. We know very little on this period. I think that there is a difference in productivity between North and South, and this the main reason of the difference. But on the other hand, I would stress also the economic policy by the government, the Italian government, the fascist government on one hand, and the laws against immigration in the United States. The fact is that in that period, the population in the South reached about 37%. And this is just the epoch when there is an impossibility for the southern population to emigrate, and population in the south was mainly employed in agricultural activities with a very low productivity, and this is perhaps the reason of this increase, while the clustering of industry in the north increases the advantage, the industrial advantage in the north. Now, let's come to the third period, that is of the industrialization, of the weak industrialization in the South. This was an important period for the South, in my view. It was because of the economic policy, certainly, but together with the economic policy, investment by entrepreneurs and other factors I will recall briefly. Certainly, if we compare today Mezzogiorno, the Italian Mezzogiorno, and the economic growth in this period with that of many world countries, we discovered that Mezzogiorno is a success story in a sense, because the rate of increase, the rate of growth in this period was higher in the south than the north, because of the economic policy, but because also some important changes taking place in this period. That is the growth of the internal and the foreign market. I repeat only what has been already said in the paper presented yesterday and today. Technical change affecting in particular industry, cheap energy in that period, in these 2 decades after the Second World War. Then the high growth rate, and particularly the high growth rate of industry. The unlimited, we could call the unlimited supply of labor in that period. So we see that looking at the condition of the economic situation of Mezzogiorno in the 60s, we could also present an optimistic view of the trend of the disparity in Italy. It was a classical inverted U-curve, and we see, in any case, that this inverted U-curve was incomplete, and after 73, with the decline of the importance of the share of industry within the Italian economy, and also the share of the labor force employed in industry on the total labor force, we see that from that period on we have a strong change in the curve, and a new increase in disparity. And today we are in front of a stable situation where in the the per capita GDP in the south is about 60% of that in the center and the north, taking into account a difference in prices between south and north. We could increase a little this the share of the south in comparison with the north, but after all we have the impression of stability. So instead of an inverted U curve, we find here an inverted S curve. That is an incomplete reduction of disparity. So to summarize my opinion, and I think also to summarize with some difference what has been written in the paper, I saw the start of the industrialization as the period when the disparity between North and South starts. At the beginning, the industry can't involve all the regions at the same time, but for geographic reasons, obviously is focused in some, is localized in some specific place. We have later a spread of industry, and the involvement of many regions. Industry increased not only in the south, but not only in the north, but in the south. But with the stop of this industrial spurt, we have again a stop in this decline of disparities, and the stop seems to last still now.
Thank you. Let's collect a few questions. Vera Zamagni. Okay, I'm coming.
Thank you very much. I'm Vera Zamagni. I generally agree with your framework that you've set, and I pinpoint 3 questions that are still to be worked at. One is on agriculture, because the reason why agriculture seems so much more advanced in the south than in the north is that the northern agriculture is an intensive agriculture, and therefore if you measure it per capita, then there are so many workers inside it that ends up appearing. But the impact of an intensive agriculture is not only on income, but it is also on wealth. An intensive agriculture produces much more wealth than an extensive agriculture. And this has never been taken into consideration in any of the reasoning about agriculture. So that I think that there is still much to do on the agricultural matter, and Malanima was right in saying that we are sort of reasonably sure on agriculture starting from 1891 onwards, but not backwards. And so all the backward, even, I mean, done by Federico, was done in a very preliminary way. He himself admits it. No? So I don't know whether he is around, but he can confirm if he is. But you can ask him, and he says this already. So this is first. Second has to do with what you said about the impact of policies. Yes, policies have an impact, positively or negatively. No, we have seen the negative impact in the interwar years of the policies for armaments, of the policies for bailing out operations, had a very negative impact on the South. Maybe unwillingly, you know, without actually an aim to reach this target, but the result was that. Then we've seen the industrial policies to have a reasonably positive impact in the period of after Reconstruction. And it would be interesting exactly to measure the period, you know, because we have the census data that allows us only to measure 1951, 61, but maybe it didn't start in 1951. But certainly, then we have to ask the questions, how wrong were the economic policies after 1971? No? Because if policy matter, then they matter also after that period. And perhaps precisely because they were not industrial policies. but there were policies of very different types, and they sort of discontinued the trend. Maybe there was no still autonomy in carry-on industry in the place, so they still, in a way, to be accompanied in this. And instead, there was a switch on welfare policies and so on, assistance, and I mean, you can carry on. My third point is about services. I've seen in many other also presentations that the services are entirely overlooked. No? But as we come to more recent times, certainly not back in time is agriculture that matters, and we have to understand exactly the impact of agriculture. But when we come to more recent times, and then we also have to understand the services. Which kind of services have been, in fact, taking root in the South, and which kind of services instead in the rest of the country? And I think this can add to the explanation of the problems that the South has.
I'm actually a little bit puzzled, and I turn this to both the discussant and the author, because it seems to be an implicit view that the policies were all good in the 1950s and 1970s, just because they decreased temporary this divergence. But it's quite puzzling to me that you could actually throw a lot of money and decrease it temporarily, but they may not have any permanent impact. So they're just costly policies that don't have any rationale in the long term. So what is the evidence that more of these, if what some of you seem to imply, would have been better? They continue doing that. Where is the economic intuition? I mean, I guess it has to be like, some spillover, but, where is the proof that these were good policies in the first place? Because it doesn't seem to me that the South becomes self-sufficient in any way, and so there is no, at least economic proof in this data that these were the right policies ultimately.
That's a very good question. Okay, more? Yeah. Sorry.
Thank you. Two questions. The first is looking at the graph there of convergence and divergence. It's striking that the two main periods of convergence come in the immediate aftermath of the two great waves of immigration out of the South. Question, what should we learn from that? Is it accident, or is there something more? If so, what are the implications for future policy on the South? My second question is different. At the beginning of the paper, the authors say, absolutely rightly, that in all modern processes of growth, phenomena of regional disparity are normal, and that so is convergence. In the Italian case, we see that happening in the convergence between the northwest, northeast center, but not in the case of the South. Now, I would like the authors to follow on from that and tell us what other case in contemporary modern economic development is comparable to the persistence over 150 years, or even if we shorten it, over 100 years of the north-south disparity in Italy. Thank you.
I have two questions too. The first one stems from what I read in the first page of the paper, where I read from unification to the mid-1880s. It was a time of a relatively equal output levels and similar growth rates. Now, the question is, how does this fit with the mountains of evidence that we have on non-monetary indicators
that showed that there were huge disparities, regional disparities in many dimensions. Life expectancy, the difference between Liguria and Basilicata in life expectancy was more than 10 years. At the time when the total life expectancy was about 30 years. Infant mortality rates is another example. The incidence of child labor is yet another example. And education that you mentioned, the divides are striking. So it's kind of funny that GDP looks completely uncorrelated or perhaps even negatively correlated to most other non-monetary indicators. I'm very puzzled about this. The second question refers to this, is perhaps for the discussant. I think that this is not in the paper. If I understand this correctly, that implies that inequality is higher in 2010, end of the period, instead of in late 19th century, which for me is very hard to believe. It's counter any evidence I've seen before, is puzzling in the light of the policies that have been and the money that has been put in place to reduce inequality since after post-World War II. So I wonder whether you have an explanation for this very unusual pattern where we observe higher modern inequalities than inequalities observed in ancient times, which is really counterintuitive to me. Thank you.
Okay, one last question over here. No? No. Okay. Okay. So maybe we should let since we're running late, we should let the authors respond.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the suggestions. First of all, I want to say that our work is not based on, our work is based on data that some very good historical researchers have found for us. So really I think we cannot go through the debate around the level of regional differences at the beginning of our period. What we stress in our paper is just the dynamics of the difference. And I have to say, we see that the dynamics is not so different between the different kind of time series that we found. So I think that our results are quite robust with respect to the turning points in the period. Just another thing, it's about the roles of economic policy. I think the previous paper, our paper are really very well integrated, because the first paper give us a story about a natural divergence between North and South. So that at the end of the natural divergence, we should have two regions that are so distant. Actually, we explain with the policy why at the end the regions are, of course, different, but not so different. And the reason what we found is that there is a big period, a large period of convergence just after the Second World War. And this period, the national growth is really linked to regional growth and is really linked to the South. And I think regional policy played a very important role on that. That's okay.
Very, very briefly to Professor Giovanni, thanks a lot for your comments. My only comment on comment is that the composition of services is in part linked to the growth of industry. So implicitly we may have a part, but of course we need more details and more public services versus private services and so on. To Professor Vecchi, it is written what we see in the data, that output gap is small. In Malanima's data is very small. In your data is a little bit larger, but it is relatively small, while other, as I showed in one slide, other conditions, socio-economic condition, literacy, for example, is completely different. To Professor Sapienza, we are not saying that policies are positive. We are saying that policies influence the convergence on that, are very important in influencing, in negative and in positive terms. Governor Draghi was saying the day before yesterday here that what Italy did in the 50s and in the 60s was a positive story. That part of industry that was born in that period in the South was important for overall Italian growth, but we still have to judge if that was the right policy. We underline that the part of small and medium enterprises that were based in the South in the early 50s disappeared, so we have to debate about Cassa del Mezzogiorno and what else. To Professor Davis, emigration and convergence is a fact. My policy implication would not be only favor emigration to get convergence, but I think that we have to think more of the long-term effect of emigration and on the size of emigration and of returning migrants or not. So I mean, the mathematical effect of emigration on income per capita is positive, but we have to see also due to its size and to its destination, its effect in the long term. People moving from Basilicata to Latin America and never coming back, never sending remittances probably were negative for the development. People going from Veneto to Germany and coming back after 5 years were probably positive, more positive for development. And the last comment is regarding comparison of the Italian case. In his seminal paper of 1965, Professor Williamson said that at a time in history, convergence begins. Why? Because movement of capital, movement of people, and policies. Now, in Italy, we see this missing turning point that seems to us very interesting, because in a period at the beginning of the 20th century, people started to move from south, and capital probably started to move, at least to Bagnoli, or there was a conscience of the movement of capital toward the south, and policies were there. And this was stopped by the First World War and fascism. So my consideration is that what is exceptional in Italy is the length of the part of the inverted U that goes upward. It's too long in Italy. And then we have to go to the 70s. Why it stops? It stops more or less all over Europe. But in the Mezzogiorno we developed too late, probably. We had too little time to go down that reverse the shape U, so we arrived in the mid-70s when regional convergence stops more or less all over the world. We were still too high, but probably this is a suggestion, probably the story is another one. I think we need still to research, starting from the idea that this is a very interesting story, and it's not worth very simple phrases on very simple solution to explain it. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. We have a break, and we reconvene at 4:30. Sorry, at 4:30.